for Tuesday, the 12th of October at in this virtual meeting room. So we've got two items on our agenda today, the Rma Reform Natural and Built Environment Bill Exposure Draft and Rma Compliance Briefing. Just before I start, I've got three apologies from councillors Martin, Peters and Councillor Reid. I think everybody else is present and accounted for, hopefully. So I'm going to hand over. Who am I handing over to?
Robert will be
yes, handing over to me.
And then Robert.
Yep.
But yeah, just acknowledging, particularly with the Natural and Built Environments Bill, there's not a lot that's new. So we had initial briefing prior to council making a submission on the exposure draft of the bill. There obviously is a bit of ground to cover in terms of the submissions made across different sector groups and across the sector. But really, this was off the back of a council law request to just take to provide a bit of an overview and ultimately a bit of an update on where things are at. Not a lot's moved since the last briefing, but Rob will give you a bit of an overview of the timeline and the next steps as well. On the other side of things, in the Rma double header, double feature, I should say, just introducing Kate, who will lead things. So Kate's our team leader for compliance monitoring. Many of you, I don't think any of you will have met her before, so it's just an opportunity for her to work you through the work that the team have done and the policy and potentially the delegation side of things. So I'll hand over to Robert to kick off on the Natural Built Environment Bill first.
Cheers, Tom.
Yep, thanks, Tom. And I will share my screen and presentation. Okay, is that showing on everybody's screen? Sorry, I'll go back to the first slide.
Yes, thanks, Robert.
Okay. Yes, as Dom mentioned, not much has changed since our last briefing, which was in July, when we initially had the draft Natural and Built Environments Bill exposure draft released for submissions. So we had the council briefing, discussed what was in the exposure bill, and then talked about what some of the key issues we might raise in a submission would be. There hasn't been any real significant updates since, but wanted to highlight some of the key submissions that have come through and look at next steps. And as a starting point, we'll step through a brief sort of overview of the resource management reform and the exposure draft and what was in that. So the Resource Management Act, the RMA reform, has been going on for several years, or it's been in the making for several years. But the first sort of tangible progress was earlier this year, in that February-April time slot, where there was more stakeholder engagement undertaken on the potential replacement bills for the RMA. And we've recently had the exposure draft that was released in June for submissions. So submissions closed in August on that, and there were over 3,000 submissions received. And a select committee is reviewing those submissions. So it's essentially a two-stage process from here. So the first stage is that there's a select committee inquiry into the exposure draft. And so that's been out for submissions. Submissions have closed, and the committee will now report back its findings to Parliament. And the second stage is essentially the normal legislative process. So the full bill will be introduced to Parliament in early 2022 and will involve the introduction, first reading, select committee, second reading, essentially the normal process. And it's been indicated that there will be another opportunity for public and stakeholder feedback during that second stage of the process. And it's also been indicated that the government will try to pass the bill before its term ends in November 2023. So that's the timeline for a bit of an overview of the RMA reform. What the reform is looking like and what it's been signaled through the exposure draft is that the RMA would essentially be replaced with 3 new pieces of legislation. The main one would be the Natural and Built Environment Act, the NBA, which would be the direct replacement for the RMA. And then alongside that, there would be the Climate Adaptation Act and the Strategic Planning Act, which would each serve their own separate functions, but they would all be related. And there's this diagram which hopefully shows up large enough on the screens to read some of the text. It is a bit kind of confusing and complicated, but it sort of gives a sense of how these things will be connected. So on the left, you can see the Natural and Built Environment Act and its sort of hierarchy, where it has a purpose, and then it sets down into the national planning framework, which sets the national direction and has environmental bottom lines. And we'll touch on some of that in more detail in the upcoming slides. And then that feeds into the natural and built environment plans, which are essentially regional level plans that would be the sort of district plan equivalent for us. And we'll touch on that more as well. And then on the other side is the Strategic Planning Act, which the main piece of work coming out of that is the long-term regional spatial strategy, which feeds into the national planning framework and the natural and built environment plans, and the Climate Adaptation Act is feeding into both. And yeah, I guess they would all link together once they're all released, but the timing of them is intended to be staggered. So the Natural and Built Environment Act and the Strategic Planning Act, it's signaled that they would come out first, with a target being that November 2023. The Climate Adaptation Act would be slightly behind those, but we don't have much information on the CAA yet. So in terms of the NBA, the Natural and Built Environment Act, the exposure draft was very light on information, so it didn't have a lot of detail, but it did, I guess, give a sense of some of the overview, the purpose, and how some of the pieces of the puzzle would fit together. It broke it down into 4 parts. It broke the NBA down into 4 parts with sort of intro, purpose, and then talking about the national planning framework and the natural and built environment plans. So I'll just step through each of those quickly. So the purpose and key objectives of the NBA are listed here. I won't read through each of those, but at a high level, they are very similar to the key objectives of the Resource Management Act. You know, and are generally aligned with that, but there are some differences. An example is giving effect to the principles of te tiriti, which is different than the RMA is more take into account language, so it gives stronger emphasis to that, and the NBA places stronger emphasis on things like focusing on positive outcomes rather than just adverse effects, which is more the RMA's approach. So yeah, at a high level, same sort of intent and objectives, but some key differences in there. The national planning framework is, yeah, as I mentioned, the one national document that sits over the regional plans, and it's intended, or the impression is that it would replace the national environmental standards, national policy statements, those sort of documents, and it would have directive environmental outcomes with environmental bottom lines that are signaled to be clear and measurable and fairly firm. And it's one of the key outcomes is that it will resolve conflicts. So where there's issues of, do we protect this coastal environment versus do we provide for new infrastructure going through that area? It would set out clear direction on sort of what gets priority or what the policy framework would be in making a decision around that sort of thing. It's also signaled that these would typically have immediate legal effect. So when a NPF came out, any regional plans or other things that sit under it would likely just have to give effect to it directly and maybe without any further local consultation process or any other consultation process. And there's a range of matters that NPFs can look at, whether it's air, freshwater, coastal, outstanding natural landscapes, areas of significant indigenous vegetation, urban areas, housing supply, infrastructure. So it's all, regional and district issues kind of wrapped up in one. And then that leads into the natural and built environment plans, which are essentially would be a regional plan. And the intent is that there would just be one NBE plan per region, and it would replace regional policy statements and regional and district plans. So across the country, there would be over 100 different policy statements and plans that all have to be combined into about 14 different regional plans. And it would be covering all the different functions as well. So regional and district functions, whether it's land use and subdivision or coastal marine areas, and natural hazards, the different things that go across regional and district councils. So it would cover a wide range of things and a large land area as well. So up here we just have one plan for all of Northland. And again, the intent is that these plans would be fairly clear and directive, so they would help resolve any conflicts that would pop up, and there would be more certainty for plan users, developers, landowners, with less emphasis on the consenting process, so that it would be clear what's allowed, what isn't allowed, whereas the RMA process places a lot more emphasis on the decision making at a consenting level. And the other key point with this is that the natural and built environment plans would be developed by a plan committee. So they would be, the planning committees would be consisting of representatives from local government, central government, and Montefenua. And the exposure draft touches on what these look like and who would be represented in them and how they would work, but it doesn't provide a ton of detail. So it does make it a little bit hard to know how it would play out in reality and what exactly sort of the plan change process would look like and what level of involvement local government would have and how residents and other stakeholders could get involved in the plan change process. But it does look like this is maybe one of the main areas of change under the new system, that the planning committee would essentially run the plan change process and would be the one approving or rejecting recommendations that come from a hearing panel rather than the local council would, as it does under the RMA. And again, that the representation on the committees is unknown at this stage in terms of how many representatives, how that's sort of divided by district up here, or sort of affiliation, if it's more local authority members or more central government. It's unclear at this stage. yeah, and one of the key points, which let's go through here. One of the key points that we made in our submission was a change like that going to a planning committee is a fairly drastic change from the RMA, or a big change in terms of how that local decision-making process will work. And since the exposure draft has such little information, it did make it hard to provide a appropriate submission for that scale of a change, to know what the level of, or what the details are around that planning committee and how it would work. There is still a lot of unknown and uncertainty around it. But some of the key submission points that we did focus on were around the submission timeframes and limited information, the logistical and resourcing implications of how this actually plays out, especially when looking at combining all of our regional plans and policy statements into one plan. Yeah, how that works on the ground, how we make sure that we have enough resourcing to transition into those new plans. The reduction of localized decision making was a big one that we touched on, and making sure that there is sufficient opportunities in those plan making processes, both at the regional plan level. So I guess around how that planning committee is going to work, and where counselors and council and residents and stakeholders can be involved in the process and what that looks like, but also at the national planning framework level, since the sound of that is that it's going to be very directive and potentially have immediate legal effect whenever changes are made to the national planning framework. So that to make sure that there are opportunities for local input at that national planning level. The relationship with other legislation and existing processes. So we have different Hapagoniwi management plans here, spatial plans, other structured plans, things like that were all done under the RMA. And so making sure that those have a place in the new system and still, yeah, will be given effect to or taken into account as appropriately. One of the other main issues is the conflicting approaches to resource management, and how the exposure draft, it sets lofty goals in terms of improving the environment, setting environmental bottom lines, achieving better sustainability and reducing greenhouse emissions, and achieving all that while also encouraging growth and supporting development and improving housing affordability. So some of those conflicting and competing issues, it's not exactly clear how those will be addressed and how it would all be achieved. And then on the environmental bottom lines and environmental limits, I guess the unintended consequences of that, if it's seen as more of a target, if there are environmental bottom lines that are set, then will anything that is right up to that bottom line, will that be acceptable? And when will that lead to the best overall outcome? And again, that need for local participation at all levels of the planning process. So yeah, that was an overview of the exposure draft and the RMA reform so far in our submission. And then the next few slides are just some highlights from some of the submissions that were received. As I mentioned, there were over 3,000 submissions received. Some of the key infrastructure groups, not surprisingly, highlighted that they thought the bill favored the natural environment over the built environment, and that there needed to be more certainty and clear consenting pathway and processes for infrastructure outcomes to make sure that infrastructure can be provided. Recently, there's been quite a bit of case law through the Resource Management Act around competition between environmental outcomes and provision of infrastructure, and there has been a lot of debate in that space. So looking for essentially more clarity and certainty around how that infrastructure is going to be provided. Some submissions here, mainly from New Zealand Maori Council and Federation of Maori Authorities Incorporated, touched on that approach with te tiriti and how that's given effect to, and wanting to highlight that it shouldn't just be the principles, it should be te tiriti itself, and to elevate that to a higher level, I guess. And then similar to some of our submission points around funding and logistics and resources and how these changes would actually be implemented. Development groups, again, I guess not surprisingly, thought that the exposure draft favored the environment over urban development. And throughout the hearing process, this was one of the key things that popped up for the select committee, and they were particularly interested in the tensions between enabling development and managing environmental bottom lines and environmental outcomes, and whether or not the NBA would actually be making it easier to build infrastructure and unlock more land for housing, or if the environmental bottom lines and sort of higher level purpose of some of the NBA exposure draft around the environment would stifle some development outcomes. And on the flip side of that, the environmental groups supported the concept of the environmental limits and some of the outcomes, but I guess had some concerns about how they would work. Wanted to make sure that they were firm and once established, they were set and can't be weakened. There was also some submission points around having targets for improvement. And again, that aligns with focusing on positive outcomes and to encourage those positive outcomes. And Forest and Bird in particular opposed the exposure draft and wanted to retain the RMA as it is with some amendments. Wasn't confident that the limits would actually be limits, and wanting more of a prioritization of emissions reductions. It is anticipated that some of that will come through more in the Climate Adaptation Act, but again, there's not much information on that at this stage. And then the other sector that I didn't put a slide in for, but from other territorial authorities and local government, the submissions were generally aligned with ours, with some of the key points around resourcing and how we are actually going to be able to transition to this new legislation logistically, as well as that local level decision making, and whether or not the new regional plans and national planning framework with the with the planning committee are going to take away some of that local decision making, and to make sure that there is sufficient representation at a local level and a local government level in these processes going forward. And then the $1 million question of can the NBA achieve both better environmental outcomes while also making it clear how development can happen more efficiently and enable more affordable housing and support growth. That seems to be one of the key things that, reading through the exposure draft, it promises a lot, but how it's actually going to achieve those things isn't quite clear. And the next steps with the reform is the select committee reports back on the submissions in a couple weeks. And it's signaled that there will be further opportunity to provide feedback once the full bill is introduced. And at that stage, we'll have more details on all this stuff. So So we would be able to sink our teeth into it a bit more and get a better sense of what it will actually mean and what some of the things will look like, both in terms of how we sort of operate and what the processes will be, as well as what the environmental and development and growth and infrastructure outcomes would look like. Then following that, there would be the standard legislative process with the NBA, the Natural and Built Environment Act, and the Strategic Planning Act going together and intending to pass into law this parliamentary term, and then the Climate Adaptation Act following that. And MFE has indicated that it's working on a transition program and will seek input around measures to support the successful transition to the new system as we get more information and the program develops. So I think that's it slide-wise. It was a quick overview of a relatively large and significant piece of legislation. So happy to go through any other details on the exposure draft and the bill itself, or talking about next steps or any other topics around that.
Robert, thank you. That was really comprehensive and covered. As you were speaking, I was thinking, I'd be interested. And you covered all the things that I had covered off. So well done, you. Councillors, any questions or feedback to Robert at this stage? Goodness gracious, look, everybody's interested. So I've got Greg Innes, then Shelley, then Ken Cooper.
Thank you. Thank you. Your Worship. I apologise for getting knocked out of the internet on the previous meeting, but it's well outside my hands. I really wanted to comment on the report that's just come out from reviewing local government. It's an interim report raising the platform, and I, excuse me, and I thought it was quite interesting what they had to say, because in the discussions that I've had on the Governance and Strategy Advisory Group in Wellington, really has been this whole question of governance and local governance in terms of the RMA. I thought that the interim report by Review of Local Government would pick that up. It has mentioned it, but it has mentioned it actually for reference purposes on page 54, that it essentially looks towards a regional framework, and there, when you have a look at the spatial planning, and then you have a look at the natural and built environment, you have two committees. So you've got a joint committee for the Strategic Planning Act that actually has central government representation, Māori and local councils and regional council. And then you have, in terms of the natural and built environment, again, you have local councils. I think, Robert, Department of Conservation is mentioned as the government representation on that, along with Māori. So, when we have a look at where we're going, the whole question of placemaking, because we're starting to look at a more outcome-focused approach, it's getting incredibly regionalised and centralised. And one of the real issues, and you mentioned it, Robert, is this whole question of to what extent do local communities have an input into these placemaking exercises. And that's where I think where we're going at the moment in terms of placemaking. We really need to illustrate the importance of local community in decision making, because if they're all just regional plans, and the governance structure is really between central government and the regions, we start to miss out on local governance. And it's quite a big issue. I think it's the biggest issue at the moment in the review of the RMA. I think probably 80% of it's good, better than the RMA. The problem really centres around that local governance aspect. So I don't know whether you want to comment on that, Robert, but I feel quite strong about it. That's for real. Thank you.
I can hear your passion, Greg. Robert.
Yeah, I guess just one quick comment on that is the Spatial Planning Act, which we don't have a ton of information on at this stage. It's been signaled that, you know, that would have a regional sort of spatial plan, and then could flow into more localized spatial plans that would have more weight than they do under the current system, where right now spatial plans are non-statutory, and you know, when it comes to the plan change process, they don't necessarily determine that what's said in the spatial plan is what's going to happen. So it could be that, you know, potentially there's less local involvement in the NBA level, but in the spatial planning level, there might be more involvement, and then the spatial plans have more legal weight and have more influence when it actually comes to the plan writing, rule writing stage of things.
So if I could just comment, then it's quite interesting if you have a look at the governance structure for the regional, for the spatial plan, and then you have a look at the governance structure for the natural and built environment plans. How do they relate? And that's a discussion. Will some of them be on both or no? So there's quite a few issues to be addressed there. Yeah. Thank you.
Cheers, Greg. Shelley?
Thank you, Robert, for your clear and concise presentation, which I really appreciated. And I would have to say it was far more so than the documentation that you're working from, which claims to be clear and directive and is anything but, as far as I can make out. Your analysis and the submission points that you raised, I totally support all of them. They highlight the similar concerns that are being expressed by in a variety of articles from other entities, particularly agricultural type entities, which see a huge conflict coming between the provision of infrastructure and the ability to be able to block anything actually happening. Like any development can be blocked by a lot of the safeguards that are being put in place. So whether we're going to get an even balanced view of these things, that's, to me, well, to most of the articles I'm reading as well, seems to be pretty important. And I agree with Greg, you know, a particular concern is about the one size for all. I mean, in New Zealand, everything changes so quickly from one type of geology to another, to one forested area to a coastal area, all of which need a different treatment. And yet it seems to me that the intent of this document is to guide everything from the Wellington viewpoint with Maori and forest and bird input as a balance. And I don't think that's going to work. What we'll have is a lot of conflict, and within the documentation that I've been reading, I haven't actually seen any specific way of resolving that type of conflict between enabling the infrastructure and the blocking of development. So I can only wish you all the best with the submission that you're planning to put in and support the points that you are raising. Thanks.
Shelley, I think our submission's already gone. So yeah.
Oh, I probably signed it.
Yes, I think you did.
Thanks, Robert.
Well done, you. Kim.
Thank you. Massive changes, aren't there? And it's quite interesting what we've just heard in that presentation from Robert, and thank you very much, Robert, was that we, potentially are going to lose the local input into the planning, and Greg and Shelley have said that, and I agree with them. It's one of a raft of changes that are coming, and you take into account the regulatory body for the water, and the fact that the very first priority for that regulatory body is the health of the waterway, which, while is laudable, it all adds to the argument that change is coming our way. And I guess Greg referred to the local government review document, which we've all received a sort of a pre-look at. And the changes are enormous. I can't help thinking that we focus on the three waters. It's a very emotional one, the water one. But the reality is, as that review document says, is that the changes are coming, that the way to manage those changes is through the good relationships with central government, whether we like it or not, and whether some people would, at the expense of their political views, ignore that. And I think it's behoved on all of us to try and work a path through where we can work with the people who are making the rules, put our submissions in, be clear about where our red lines are and what is important to us, but not close the door on a constructive relationship with Wellington, because all that will do is harm us and put us on the back foot. So I guess as we go forward, Robert, I'm heartened to hear that you think perhaps the placemaking plans will have allow the local voice and perhaps have a greater legal standing. But there is so much going on at the moment for us to think about that, I think we must tread carefully and keep all lines of communication as open as we can, while knowing exactly where we stand, our red lines are. So thank you.
Thanks, Ken. Vince?
Yeah, it's expected I'll have a different point of view to Ken on this, but I think it's actually vitally important at this present moment with Robert and the way you've written your submission and everything like that. I think it's vitally important that we actually emphasise the amount of local stuff. One of the big things that the documents do pick up, and I do notice through it picking up, is the emphasis that it wants your local council to be working with your local hapus. Now, if you want to get change, if you want to get things to actually happen, you need to have your local hapus on side with you to make it happen. And that's basically what I picked up out of the document, because it kept referring back to Mana Whenua and in all places. So the only way to do that is to have your local hapus on side. And I'm just noticing it, and that's why I said I disagree with Ken, because sometimes central government doesn't know what's best. And sometimes you actually have to get things actioned by getting the local people involved. So thanks, Robert.
Thanks, Vince. Any other feedback to Robert? I guess as you were speaking, Robert, and hearing your reflection on the submissions that have been received by the select committee, sort of on the one hand, you've got one group saying it's going too far and the other one saying it's not far enough. It probably is a fairly good indication that somewhere in the middle is the balance point, that is the appropriate place, and hopefully with local input that can reflect the aspirations but also the cautions of our local community. So hopefully that comes through in these regional committees. And again, I just heard you saying a lot of times that we're not yet sure how that's going to be, how we get local input. There's still a lot of unknowns, and hopefully as the select committee goes through their process and recommends that they're taking into account that feedback from the local government sector is providing it to them as well. So I see Greg Innes with his hand up. Greg?
Thank you. And I think this really is just a framework at the moment that needs detailing, and that's acknowledged. But I just want to pick up on Vince's point there, and You know, under this legislation, and Robert, I'll be interested in your view, in terms of hapu, hapu management plans have to be given effect. In other words, they have equal status to a district plan. Up to date, we have to take into account. So what we've got in terms of local hapu is that their plans will have equal status under this legislation. As I understand it, I'll be interested in your comments, Robert.
Yeah, through the chair, that's my understanding as well. And I guess one thing that we will need to work, not necessarily that they have equal standing, because they wouldn't be their own sort of piece of legislation, but that they have to be given effect to through regional plans and national planning frameworks and the other legislation that comes in. But yeah, one thing we've been working through with Dom and Rma and others at council is, you know, I would currently have I think 6 iwi hapu management plans, and they're in a lot of places very high level, and so I think there's probably some work to do in the transition to this new legislation in developing more detailed hapu management plans that can sort of more easily be translated into regional plans, or those provisions can be more clearly given effect to. When you have very high level blanket statements in hapu management plans, it does, or in any sort of spatial plan or non-statutory plan, it does make it hard to give effect to such a high level concept. So I think we do need to do some work to kind of update any of those sort of documents, those spatial plans, structure plans, hapu plans, anything like that we need to work through in the transition to this.
Thanks, Robert. I've got Tricia, then Nicholas and Phil.
I just had a quick question really for Robert. Just Robert, do you know what other council submissions were like? Did they raise similar points to ours? And also, what was the LGNZ submission like? Thank you.
Yeah, through the chair, we discussed at our last council catch up here with NRC, FNDC, and KDC, and all of our submissions were along the same lines. And I think that was right before we lodged our submission, so we were all on the same page with a lot of the key points. LGNZ's submission was long.
Of course.
So yeah, sorry, I don't have a good summary of it on hand, but
was it similar points though?
Yeah, I think there was a lot of similarities. Some submissions ended up going in a lot more detail and really sort of nitpicking some of the definitions and stuff that they put in. So it was good to see that there were a lot of submissions that went to that level of detail. But yeah, all the councils up here kind of kept it high level and had similar talking points.
Okay, thank you.
Yes, Tricia. Nicholas.
Thank you. Yes, no, thank you very much, Robert, for the your explanation of all that. I mean, it's one of those spaces it's going to upset a lot of people because of the systems we've had put in place. Have we consulted the wildlife and whatnot that we're impacting by putting these things in there? I mean, the sea isn't going to care about where we put a road. It's just going to wash it out eventually anyway. So unless we actually take into consideration what we're putting into these places, we're going to have to deal with the after effects. And nature will win out in the end, regardless. So we do need to work our processes around the natural environment as well. I mean, I for one say it's fantastic that we're looking at that it's being looked at in the fact of the natural environments being taken precedence over our built environment, because we do have impact on other systems that are out there, and it's not all resources; it is all different forms of life, as we are as well. So it's one of those things. It won't be favorable by anybody, but in order to actually take a stance and actually curb some of the impact that we actually have on the environment for, as I said earlier in in the workshop, the exploitation of the past that people haven't cared about it, and even though people are caring about things these days, there's still a lot of greed and stuff as well. Yeah, it's one of those things. I mean, it's no surprise coming from me as any would be listening. It's yeah.
Thanks, Nicholas. Phil.
Yeah, thank you. It's this kind of worries me, the direction the government's going on a lot of this stuff, because what reading through the document there, it shows that they get elevating up Doc, who's probably been the most unsuccessful land carer in the history of New Zealand. You know, they've got the biggest estate in New Zealand to look after, and throughout the country we have complaints. We see TV items and that where they're not performing, so they're being elevated up, and with a history of failure. And now we've got our Maori hapu partners and that being elevated up, very inexperienced at that level, and they'll have to learn a lot. And I don't see anything in there about how they're going to bring Maori up to speed as quick as they wish to. And I think we should concentrate on that, because there are models around the country we could help them out with. And so basically saying that, it just relegates our councils, our like-minded councils, right down with the level of used car salesmen. You know, they don't trust us. They don't think we can do anything. You know, this mistrust of elected members has got to be taken more seriously than a lot of councils are. And I think we've been put here by our people to represent them, and we do our best. And overall, our council stacks are pretty damn good. And you know, but to have it be dismissed and putting a central model out, trying to get it more centralised, takes more and more power away from us and our ability to do things for our ratepayers. So we all know it's a big push to try and get unitary authorities, but after that, what's after unitary authorities? You know, it's a straight out socialist model. It'll go to one person in Wellington making the call. Just, you know, there's some serious things that we haven't touched on. But I'd just like to go back. I chair a dock camping ground, and the local managers for a while had to look up the map to see where it was. You know, that's how bad and out of touch I've been. So good luck to whatever happens.
Thanks, Phil. Any other feedback to Robert on the process so far?
Sure, if I could comment. I notice in the review of local government interim report, and picking up on Phil's point, they do mention the need for a transition process in it, particularly as it relates to Māori and capacity of Māori to engage. It was one when the RMA came in, it really got off to probably a shaky start, and so within this they are recommending that there's quite a strong transition process. So you can look at it that two ways, but it's mentioned within that report.
Thanks, Greg. Robert, thank you so much for the update to us. This is going to be a long and convoluted process before but clearly there is a path with that first bill, with the government wanting to get that finalised and signed off before the end of this term of government, which is 2023. So it's really valuable that we have our input and our feedback and the updates as you've given us today. So thank you so much.
Yeah. I'm happy to, as we start to get more information, to come back and feed through those updates. I guess the one thing, just as a parting, it is hard to say, since there is so little information on it at this stage, what exactly it's going to look like. But personally, I'm kind of excited about this. That, while we have talked around a lot of the different issues that might pop up in this, the RMA hasn't been perfect itself. And, I think having things a little bit more regionally or nationally consistent in some spaces will save a lot of time and costs. But it does have to be, carefully implemented and not sort of widespread national rules across the country and applied everywhere. But I think in general terms, there's a lot of potential good to come out of it. And in the local decision-making process, again, we don't know exactly how it's going to work, but I still would see it as if we have, say, the new regional plan, the district plan equivalent, that we would still be, having council briefings and workshops and going through what we want to go into the draft plan. And then I suppose putting that to that plan committee for notification. So it still would, in a sense, be council's plan. And then council would, or councilors in particular, would potentially have more opportunity to influence the process through submissions than they do now. Whereas now, once that plan is notified, it is essentially off to the hearing process and in independent commissioners' hands. And it comes back to councilors for a final yay or nay vote, but you're often put in a hard position where it's either accept it or reject it and restart the whole process and create a lot of costs sort of unnecessarily, or it's not, you can't change certain content, but as a submitter, you may be able to be more involved in the actual content and outcomes and process of the plan change. So it is hard to say exactly how it'll look, but I think there's a lot of potential for positives.
Thank you, Robert. I appreciate the your positivity at the end. It's really cool. We'd expect nothing less. So, councillors, let's move to the RMA Compliance Briefing with Kate. A very warm welcome to you, Kate, and we're looking forward to.
Waving furiously.
Oh, was she?
Unmute yourself, Trish.
I just had one little question, which is I just have one little question.
All right then, Tricia.
Just for Robert, who's going to be servicing the planning committees? Is it council staff or who? Did I miss something? How are they going to be serviced?
As in who would be on them, or who would be sort of the admin team behind?
Who'd be providing the reports for them and adminning them, if you like. Yeah, the staff. How would they be staffed?
Yeah, there's a clause in the exposure draft that's something that's being given thought to. So they have turned their minds to the fact that it would need some level of resourcing behind that. And I don't think it's quite clear yet, but the sense that I get is that it's from central government that would be supporting that and resourcing that.
Okay, all right, thank you. Sorry about that. Thank you.
Sorry, I missed your frantic waving there, Tricia. So now we'll move to item 2.2, the RMA Compliance Briefing. And Kate, I got a very quick glance of your screen saver, and
oh yeah,
you.
Yeah, sure. I'm just going to share my screen with you. Sorry, can you guys see this screen here?
Yes, we
sure can.
Yeah. Okay. Cool. So I'll go back. So first of all, sorry, I'll just take my camera, put my camera so you can see me. So that's not very polite of me. Sorry, there we go. I'll go back to my presentation. Okay, so you can see me and you can see the presentation before I start.
Yes, thank you.
Yeah, okay, cool. So my name is Kate Vilco. A bit about myself. I'm the team leader of Rma Approvals and Compliance. I've been working at the council since September last year. I have over 10 years town planning experience for both private companies and local government, and I have a Masters of Planning degree from Otago Uni. I started off my career as an earthquake recovery planner in Christchurch City Council. I then moved to the UK, where I worked as a self-employed senior planner, consultant, contracting out to different councils in London. However, my real passion is planning compliance, as you really can make a difference to the built natural and physical environment by working with people to achieve these outcomes. And before having my own family, I represented New Zealand twice in my age group in triathlon. And before working as a town planner, I worked as a territorial medic in the New Zealand Army. So that's a bit of background about myself. I'll move to the next slide. The purpose of this briefing is to kind of talk about the draft resource management compliance policy, which will, sorry, I've already gone through, so yeah, cool, there we go. The purpose of this, we'll obviously talk about the draft resource management compliance policy that you'll see attached to the agenda. Second of all, we will talk about what we do in the Rma compliance team. I will then talk about the current approach to education, compliance and enforcement. And then finally, I will talk about the current approach for initiating district court proceedings under the Rma at the Whangarei District Council. Okay, so go down the presentation. You would have seen the draft resource management compliance policy attached to the agenda. I wrote this policy from scratch as the previous one was done in the early 2000s. This policy outlines what we do in the Rma compliance team, examples of the things the team investigates, the principles the team is guided by. The policy also outlines how planning complaints are investigated. So we'll move to the next slide, which talks about the functions of the Rma compliance team. Most importantly, we try to work with site owners and the general public to inform them of their obligations under the district plan, as well as resource consent conditions. We always strive to work informally with people first before taking a formal enforcement action. Our team also monitors compliance with the rules in the district plan. We also respond to and investigate district plan related resource consents complaints, and our team also monitors consent notices. For example, no cats, dogs and muscle-led consent notices. I will now outline some things that the Rma team investigates. Please be kindly advised, this is not an exclusive list of the things that we investigate. Our team investigates commercial activities operating without a resource consent, non-compliance with conditions attached to a resource consent, unauthorised works to or the removal of protected trees. We also look at secondary self-contained dwellings that do not have the required resource consent. We also investigate unauthorised display of advertisements and non-compliance with consent notices. And we also look at earthworks that exceed the permitted limits in the district plan. The next slide talks about what we don't do is what our team doesn't investigate, but however other teams within council, other sort of compliance related things that other teams within council can investigate. These things include animal control matters, building consents, bylaw issues, residential noise, fly tipping, roading matters. The next slide talks about the kind of overarching principles of what the Rma compliance team are guided by. These principles are the foundation of our work and how we treat both customers and people that lodge complaints to us. The first principle is fair, reasonable and proportionate approach. This means that the team will clearly communicate to the person responsible by explaining what steps are needed to resolve the breach and the possible consequences of not complying. The next principle we're guided by is consistency of process. The Rma compliance team ensures that compliance outcomes are consistent and predictable for similar circumstances. Thirdly, the team strives to take a targeted approach by focusing on the most important problems to achieve the best environmental outcomes. Fourthly, Rma compliance strives to respond in an effective and timely manner in accordance with legislative and organisational requirements. Number 5, we are lawful, ethical and impartial. The team undertakes all investigations lawfully and impartially in accordance with the principle of compliance. Number 6, we strive to provide clear, transparent information to the community about planning and enforcement. And finally, the team makes decisions informed by a range of information sources, including other regulators, members of the community, industry, and interest groups. I will now kind of discuss how we carry out Rma compliance investigations. So firstly, when a report is received by the team, it is subject to initial screening to determine whether there is a breach of planning rules. The case is then triaged, and cases are basically assigned to one of 3 priority levels, depending on the potential harm caused to the environment and residential amenity. A site inspection will be carried out, generally dependent on what priority level the case has been assigned. So we will investigate cases within 24 hours for cases of significant harm. Like a case of a significant harm would include something like removing a protected tree without resource consent or storing excess hazardous material at a site. We will do a site visit within 10 working days for cases of medium harm. For example, a commercial activity without the required resource consent, or like, for example, a boundary setback or a commercial noise. And finally, we would do a site visit for something of low priority in 20 working days. For example, like the colours of a building, or in some cases, some like minor signage non-compliances. Yep. So once we've done that site inspection, our team will do a further assessment. If no planning compliance is found, the case will be closed immediately and the reporter will be informed of the outcome. If the site visit takes place and a non-compliance is identified, the owner or relevant party will be advised by Rma Compliance what action they need to do to remedy the breach, and a deadline will be given to complete this. The person may be asked to apply for a resource consent, or in like some cases, they may be asked to cease an activity or to remove an unauthorised structure. Every case is like different, so there's different needs for different things that happen. If no further action is taken after that deadline is given to people, then formal enforcement action may be considered by our team. There are a number of enforcement options available to council, including formal warnings, sometimes infringement notices, abatement notices, interim enforcement orders, or prosecution. Cool. And the next slide, we'll be talking about initiating district court proceedings. So in most serious cases of non-compliance, the initiation of district court proceedings may be considered necessary. Currently, the Whangarei District Council the delegation to initiate district court proceedings sits in most cases at general manager level, such as initiating court proceedings for dog prosecutions and prosecutions under various council bylaws. However, in the case of proceedings under the RMA, council has not yet delegated the decision to staff. The Solicitor General's guidelines and the Ministry for the Environment best practice guidelines suggest that decisions involving prosecution should preferably be delegated for decision at staff level. It is considered to be good practice for formal and final enforcement decisions to be delegated to, say, like a regulatory manager or a suitable decision maker. The neighbouring councils within the Northland region follow this practice with RMA prosecution decisions delegated to general manager level at the Far North District Council and Kaipara District Council and also the NRC. It is therefore recommended that consideration be given to aligning council's position with that of other local councils and national best practice guidance by delegating the decision to commence RMA prosecution proceedings to the general manager level. At Whangarei District Council, we already have robust process in place for determining whether to initiate district prosecutions, which are based on the Solicitor General guidelines. For example, as I mentioned before, in the kind of dog prosecutions and bylaws, and if delegation is made to staff, these processes will be applied to RMA prosecutions, as will the Resource Management Compliance Policy, if adopted. So, so this kind of brings me to the end of my presentation. Just to summarise today, I have discussed the draft Resource Management Compliance Policy, what the RMA compliance team does, the current approach to education compliance and enforcement, and finally, I talked about initiating district court proceedings under the RMA. So I want to thank you guys very much for your time today. I hope this makes sense, and please let me know if you've got any questions.
Thank you, Kate. I can see why you were employed by the, yeah, you can see the applause. Nice work. And that vast experience that you spoke of at the beginning really shines through. So, councillors, any questions for Kate around the process or the information she's given us? Comprehensive information. Councillor Vince, then Anna.
Yeah, Kate, well done. I was just going to ask you a very simple question. Is well, you said a report is made into council about a complaint. Do these normally come from, let's be realistic, neighbouring people, or is this coming from council staff, or is this more coming from other sources? Where do these usually come in to know that someone has breached the?
It's generally made by members of the public, essentially, say like neighbours, or quite often we get stuff come through internally as well. Yeah, so just like a range of different people. Yeah. So
is there one of the terms I've always been told not to be involved with is tattletaling. So how do we get our public to away from that tattletale on somebody else's approach?
I guess basically, you know, as I'll explain to you before, like basically we look at all complaints. Obviously, if it's a significant harm, or if it's a medium harm or low priority harm, like if the tattletailing is, you know, as it's called, is like a medium priority harm, you know, we will potentially investigate it. We'll just look at the effects on the neighbour. But if the effects on the neighbour are, you know, low, or, you know, it's causing them no harm, you know, we you know, obviously have discretion, regulatory discretion, not to investigate the case. But of course, we'd like, you know, let the person know why we're pursuing the case. So I hope that makes sense.
Yes, thank you.
No worries.
Thanks, Kate. Anna.
I just want to you in person. We have out here Vince referred players a subdivision down the end road. So I followed up questions with Kate, sort of say thanks. You came back, all the information, and you were really accurate, and I'll pass that on. So,
you're most welcome. Oh, well, thank you so much, Councillor Murphy. I appreciate it.
I think we've got every second word, Anna. The vagaries of the connections in some of our remote areas. So any other feedback from councillors? Councillor Connor. Nicholas. I
just wanted to say that it's great to have you on board, and I can see the passion and the experience that you've been able to portray in it, and thank you very much for the presentation.
Oh, you're welcome. Thank you.
Way cool.
Cool. Oh, well, thank you so much, guys. I appreciate your time.
Thanks for the effort you put into that presentation. It's really helpful for us to understand you and what your team does. Your team of small, perfectly formed team of people who go out and about.
Yeah, it's lots of fun.
Oh, you find it fun.
Yeah.
So, team, I think that's the end of our briefing for today, and just checking to make sure that did any of the team want to finish us off, close the meeting with any wise words?
Can I just mention, in case any councillors have been trying to get hold of me on my phone, that my phone suffered an unfortunate experience in the flood last Thursday and is out of commission completely. And I've been waiting for Spark to get a replacement phone that suits me, which they said hopefully might be there this week sometime. But since it took me an hour of queuing outside Spark, who let one person in at a time in level 2, yeah, I have got a landline as well. So try that if you really, really need me, or email. I'm checking my emails more regularly than usual. Thanks.
Thank you, Shelley. And Tricia, and then Dominic.
I just wondered if I have to admit I have yet to read the local government reform document, but it's because I'm saving it for a really special time. But is somebody going to do a synopsis or a presentation or something for us? And if so, when? And let's hope it's when we're back face to face, so we can see each other, not going to sleep. Thank you.
Yeah, that is a really important point. I think we will need a bit of a briefing on the impacts of that first document. Dominic, did you want to?
Yeah, just one. Great to have someone who's passionate but balanced in compliance. So thank you, Kay, and just so really want to give you a bit of an overview of both the policy and delegation today, and with a view to sending those to council. So we'll try and get them on the agenda for the next council meeting for you to consider formally.
Cool, thanks, Dom. So any last minute?
Is Rob there to respond to the local government question or not? Or Dom or someone?
Yes, Rob.
Yes, I kept going like this, but no one saw me. We will get something to you.
Thanks, Rob. Way cool. Thanks everybody for your participation in the briefing this afternoon. And now that we've been on our in our chairs for quite some time, I expect everyone to get up, go for a good big long walk. Shelley, you'll be down on the farm, no doubt.
Yeah, I'd much rather go to bed actually.
Oh, feel free. Nana naps all around.
Yep.
Thanks everyone.
Thanks for your cheering, Cheryl, too. Thank you.
Yeah.
Pleasure. And we'll see you again on Thursday for our meetings. Unfortunately, we will be in this virtual meeting room again. However, hopefully by then we'll know our fate for the rest of the time in COVID alert level 3 or whatever it is. Thanks again, team.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Ciao.
Bye.